Before we begin, here's how to earn continuing professional education credit for attending this session. Gain valuable insights by attending the podcast, then complete the assessment test to download your certificate. To do this, follow these simple steps. Click on the link in your description to access the session. Create a free account and attend the podcast. After the podcast, take the assessment test and download your certificate. It's easy, and it's free. We highly recommend checking out our subscription. Let's get started.
And I could agree to you on that. I've seen sellers that get nervous around the bank due diligence timelines. It's not just the buyers asking things; it's also for the bank. And sometimes, it can appear overwhelming for a lot of people. In fact, it's interesting, and it brings out a very interesting point. I had a PE webinar yesterday, and we did talk about in an M&A deal. We talked about uh, uh, deal stamina, to have that stamina to go through that, to stick to that deal, and be able to stick to everything that has been asked for. Obviously, you need to have a house in order, but to be patient about it while the entire process goes across, and whatever is asked for, you're able to deliver. So we talked about that.
That's a really
But
interesting topic,
Mhm.
because by a week or two before the closing is when it gets the worst, right? So even if everyone's done everything perfectly, within those last couple of weeks as we're approaching, you don't have a hard closing date at that point, because we're always waiting for something at the tail end of this process that says, hey, we need this, this, and this so that we can close at this date. But it's still a little bit up in the air. Now, all of a sudden, the realities are setting in for the buyer. I've got to run this thing. I've got to take this over. This is my new life. The seller is saying, is this really going to happen? Am I really going to retire here? And tensions are high. And that's why it's like, if there is an incompetent person somewhere in the deal team, which you see, it could be the lender, it could be the attorney on the seller side, it could be the attorney on the buyer side, it could be the attorney on the bank side.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Accounting M&A Insider. Today's episode is going to be a masterclass on SBA financing. And I've got the perfect guest for it, Ray Drew. If you ever thought about SBA loans are only for startups or restaurants, think again. Ray is not only an SBA lending expert, he's also the host of the Art of SBA, and he's helped a lot of people get deals done with government-backed financing, including in our world of accounting firm M&A. So Ray, it's great to have you with you. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So Ray, for folks who may not know you yet, what's your story? How did you really become known as the Art of SBA guy?
Well, I fell into SBA lending by accident right out of college, and 15 years later, here I am, still doing it. I love it. You get to work with entrepreneurs every day. There's a lot to learn in this little niche world of SBA. It's really gotten a lot more popular in recent years. Programs really been taken off, and I've really been at the ground zero of this movement of SBA going from a product that wasn't very popular many years back to becoming the financing vehicle that most businesses prefer to do things like buying a business, buying a building for their business, and things like that. So being one of the younger folks in the industry with this much experience, I have taken to social media. I've created a YouTube channel, which I've been growing for the past 3 years. I started a podcast before that, back in 2019. And, all of this sort of movement towards social media has, occurred alongside of all of that. So I've really, that's sort of the story of how I became who I am today, SBA Ray.
All right. That's good. That's really awesome. And I got to say, I love how you built your brand around clarity and real education. It's really refreshing. And, as we were to since we talk about SBA, what type of buyers are you typically working with these days? Are they first time buyers, strategic? What kind of buyers are there?
Well, it's a great question because this program covers a lot of ground. I mean, the program is really built to help small businesses access capital that cannot be found elsewhere in the market, whether because a bank doesn't want to do the deal or they don't want to do it with these particular terms, which is lower equity requirements, longer repayment schedules. Those are really the advantages of it. So you can get a lot of first time buyers. But in the world of business acquisition, if we're talking about those buyers, um, in the one to, let's call it $6 million transaction space, the SBA is really the only game in town because those businesses, by and large, those transactions don't have hard collateral, which is what a lot of the banks want. So those transactions, whether you're a first-time buyer or you're on your sixth acquisition, I've spoken with very sophisticated buyers, buyers that are saving their money, for a 10% injection to buy a business for 500,000, and also, ex Fortune 500 CEOs that are exiting corporate America to roll up different businesses in different industries, have $5 million at their disposal and want to use the program to acquire different businesses. I've seen that as well. So I think it's more so the former, but you do see both.
Interesting. That's really interesting. And you know, there you mentioned that getting into this industry was accidental. So was there like a moment or a deal that really pulled you into this acquisition finance world?
Well, acquisitions, I remember stumbling upon the idea that you can even do this back in like 2013 when I was maybe 2, 3 years into it. Because the first couple of years I focused on commercial real estate. And then I realized you can use a 7A loan to buy a business. And I was like, so all these businesses that are in these industrial parks and in these retail centers, you're telling me you can buy those and finance those even though it doesn't come with the building? And my mind was blown. Um, and so I knew about it for a few years, but really it wasn't until 2020 that I went really all in on the acquisition space because now the mainstream masses started to learn about that you can do this and what type of opportunity this was and how at the time, the markets were ripping in the stock market and businesses are trading for 28 times revenue, in the NASDAQ. Meanwhile, you can buy a business for 3, 4 times earnings here down on Main Street if you know how to operate a small business and lead a small team and things like that. So, between some books that came out and social media taking off during COVID, this idea started reaching the masses, and that's when it really took off.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And in fact, your experience of what you're talking about, in fact, there was an experience that was also shared with another gentleman whom I had interviewed, Bakari Akil, who came to know about the magic three-lettered word leveraged buyout, which he did not know. And then he came to know, oh, wait, I can actually buy a business without having, and his world has been different. He has been an acquirer of many businesses, growing them and then selling them. So I can definitely relate to the what you are saying. But so to change a little bit into our conversation, let's lay the groundwork here, right? For someone who's never really looked into SBA financing before, how does it work in an acquisition?
Do you want to earn CPE credit? Take this course of MyCPE 1 to earn free credit. Click the link in the description to get started.
Well, in an acquisition, which by the way, acquisitions represent about 20% of the pie. So I don't want to, I do specialize in it, I focus in it, but we don't, I don't want to only say this can be used for acquisitions. But on acquisitions, particularly, the first thing I would say is like you've got to get your house in order, as a buyer before you even enter the market and start buying a business. I say there's 3 things that you need to do, and one is make sure you have good credit. It's not just the score. It's just, hey, you need to have a track record of paying your bills on time. That's the first thing any bank's going to look for. So make sure your house is in order on the credit side. Cash is the second one. These acquisitions, the SBA requires a minimum of 10% down. So you need to be ready to stroke a check for your equity injection. And after you stroke that check, you need to make sure you have a little bit something left over so that you're not, cash poor after the acquisition, because it's not a smart position to be in. So to give you an idea, on $1 million acquisition, you probably at minimum want to have 150,000, right? So you can put in 10%, still have 50K left over or something like that. But honestly, most of the entrepreneurs I work with are a little bit more conservative than that. They don't want to write a check for, 2/3 of their life savings on an acquisition deal, which has a lot of risk. So that's up to you, but just know bankers are going to be looking for cash to put into the project and post-close liquidity. And then last but not least, the most important part by far that you need to have is experience, because these are not passive investments by any means. They're very challenging acquisitions operationally that come with a lot of risk that banks are going to look for either direct industry experience, meaning you've operated in this industry before, or strong management background where you've managed similar things. You might not have the direct industry experience, but you have a strong background in managing people, managing finances, a budget, things like that. And the third part, which is kind of hard to always put your finger on, but it's just got to make sense. Buyer fit's got to make sense, right? So ideally, you have some transferable skills that will translate over to operating this business, so that you're looking for businesses that really fit your specific expertise. And so related, maybe you worked in an adjacent industry, or maybe you just have a big marketing background and that's going to fit in really well with this particular business. But the story's got to make sense. Sometimes we see that it doesn't, and that definitely causes a lot of issues.
Well, I've heard a lot of people. I've seen a lot of buyers actually using SBA as a way to get into the deal, and I'm not sure if this is consistent across the board. But I've heard a lot of people say that the lower down payment is a big plus for them. Is that something that you're hearing a lot of buyers say when they go into an SBA deal as well?
Well, yeah, because I mean, like I said earlier, it's the only game in town. But if there are some pockets of conventional financing on these smaller deals, a bank here that you might have a relationship with, or some bank that banks that business and wants to keep the relationship. So maybe a bank does it outside of SBA. They're going to advance like maybe 60% on that deal, meaning the other 40% is going to have to be cash and seller financing. Here, we're only talking about, we'll advance 90%, 80 is also very common, but 90 is the max. And putting in 10%, and some people even put in 5% and split it with the seller and have the seller contribute 5% through the form of a standby seller note, and then buyer coming in with 5%. We do see a lot of that as well, which we do believe in preserving liquidity, and that is a big advantage of the SBA loan. So yeah, for sure.
Wow. So can you just walk us through a typical SBA deal structure, just so people can get a feel of how the financing stacks up?
Absolutely. You're going to start with structuring what we call sources and uses, but essentially there's three things that are going to go into these like 3 line items that go into the structure. It's pretty simple. The purchase price is one, which can be done as either an asset purchase or a stock purchase. The working capital is another. Most of these Main Street type deals are being sold without any cash in the business. The seller's stripping the cash. So we need to be able to replenish some of that cash. So we do a really deep dive into working capital and try to figure out what is the seller leaving behind? Is it cash? Is it AR? Is it inventory? What type of, net working capital is there? And then what's the cash conversion cycle of this business look like? And then we run an analysis to figure out, well, how much does a business need at close to make sure that there's a healthy transition that's not going to be a cash flow issue for the buyer. And if that requires us putting some working capital in the loan, which we would then just inject cash into the balance sheet at closing, then we do that. Very common on pretty much every deal. So that's the second line item. And the third is just closing costs, which are pretty standard in the SBA world. The lender only charges a small fee, and it's usually $2,500. The SBA fee is the main fee, and that's a standard fee that the SBA calculates. It's usually around 2.25% of the loan, but they calculate it in a funky way. So, but that's basically for math. $1 million deal, it's going to have a $26,000 fee. So that's about 2.5% in that example. And those fees, all of them are rolled into the SBA loan. So you total those three line items up. So you got $1 million acquisition, 25,000, let's say 50,000 in total closing costs, and then another 100K in working capital. You add those three up, you're at 1.15 million. So you're then putting in 10% of that number, right? Which is $115,000. We then finance 90%, and that's one type of structure. But honestly, the more common structure is these buyers are saying, hey, there's a lot of risk baked in here. I'm going to take you for your word, Mr. Seller, but, I'm also going to be relying on you post-closing for some industry knowledge. And so I think you should probably hold back 10% of this purchase price and I'll pay you over time. It's a seller note. I'll put in my 10%. I could do a little bit less, right? And we can structure it that way. But a lot of these buyers are saying to themselves, I don't want to, leverage too high. So maybe a 10%'s, good. And then that leaves 80 for the SBA. And that's the most common structure I've seen over the last decade is what we just call the 80-10-10 structure.
Access latest and trending CPE courses with my CPE One Unlimited Access subscription. Subscribe now.
Thank you for laying that out. I really love how you put that across. That's something that I often like even people to know about. I also cover that in my PE webinars, but thank you for sharing that out from an SBO standpoint. So let's zero in into our world, right? The accounting and tax firms world. So are these good candidates for SBA deals?
Oh, 100% on the acquisition space. You do see quite a lot of these firms being acquired, often by competitors. That it's an industry we like. We like that most of the time the financials are in order, right? You don't see that with a lot of these other businesses. So I think they're excellent candidates for SBA from a business acquisition standpoint, from a partner buyout standpoint, and from a commercial real estate standpoint as well. We've done, but I focus more on the change of ownership stuff.
True. True that, like that's really helpful. And I have found that, I guess the recurring revenue part and the owner transition support, it really makes a difference here. But what about a deal size or the seller staying on post sale? Does that really affect how the bank views the deal?
So on a accounting acquisition specifically, we like to talk about what the seller's actually doing on a day-to-day basis. Are they doing tax returns for those clients that want them to do the tax returns? Because if the buyer is not an accountant, which you do see, then they're going to need more staffing to absorb that, which changes the numbers. The other thing to look out for is just we are going to underwrite and expect for some churn. The seller is the relationship person in most of these cases and may have had longstanding relationships with some of their business clients or personal clients, I guess. And so we do want to account for some churn, 10%, 15%, maybe somewhere in that ballpark, depending on the deal and the situation. And we typically, assuming the seller has set it up properly, meaning it's not like an extremely seller dependent business, then a short transition is fine. And, 30, 60, 90 days with another, you know, 6 months or so to just say, hey, let me call you if something comes up, but you don't have to actually, come in every day and show me things. But if you have a business that's not as transferable, without layers of management in between the owner and all of the accountants, then it's harder to sell. It's a lower valuation and it's just trickier to underwrite. And yeah, you may need the seller to stay on longer in those cases. The only problem is with SBA, they limit it to 12 months. So, across the board, SBA will not allow a seller to stay on for more than 12 months to transition the business. There's only one caveat there, which I can get into. I know there's a lot of information, so I want to make sure I'm delivering it in a way that is digestible.
Okay, that was really insightful. Thank you so much for sharing. So we've talked from a buyer standpoint. So let's flip the script now, right? From a seller's point of view, what should they know if a buyer shows up with SBA financing?
So this is a great question because first of all, they have probably listed their business with a broker, and that broker will likely have had the business pre-qualified for SBA financing. The crux there is just, are they reporting profits on their tax returns? I mean, the SBA underwrites tax returns, cash flow through the underwriting style of debt service coverage. And
Right.
that's, an SBA lender is going to look at 3 years of tax returns, some interim financials, and basically say, all right, yeah, this business should fit the SBA box. Then buyers, on the other hand, they may have talked to a lender that says, hey, look, you've got cash, you've got experience doing something in the management sector or whatever, and you got good credit. So yeah, you could buy a business. The problem comes when you put those two things together. Now, does
Yeah.
it fit? That's really where the rubber meets the road. So when a buyer comes to a seller that says, hey, yeah, I'm SBA pre-qualified, seller should say, that doesn't mean a whole lot. You're someone that's serious that I should talk to. You've got some money, you've got decent credit, but we don't know that we can get this deal done. And the flip side is the same thing on the other side. The bank that pre-qualified the seller, those things are just handed out like pieces of candy. So the buyer doesn't know if the financing is, I mean, they should know it's definitely not like a done deal by any means. The conversation really starts at that point where we say, is this the right fit? So the seller is trying to figure out, is this the right fit? The buyer is trying to figure it out, and the lender is trying to figure out, starting at that point when you put those two things together, the buyer and the seller.
Very interesting. And are there like this friction? Are there friction points that tend to slow these deals down?
Yes. Yes, there are. Um, there's so much going on with these things, it's so much parallel processes happening. You have the financing, you have the buy sell negotiations. First it's due diligence, might be a quality of earnings. It on the back end, it's stock purchase or asset purchase negotiations. If they're in a building with a third party owner, they might have landlord in there slowing things down because we need a lease and we need a landlord consent that allows us to come into the property and take back the desks and chairs if the loan goes bad. Um, and then there's a lot of different things in there like insurances. There's the IRS because we're going to get tax transcripts. There's the SBA because maybe they have an idle loan that needs to get subordinated. I mean, you name it. I created a document the other day. It's kind of in process, but it's the 44 points of turbulence in an SBA loan. And I wrote down, wasn't hard to come up with 44. I wrote them all down. All these things can happen, and at least one of them will. That's why I say, we're gonna basically outline a way to get this done in 60 days, but we should account for 90, because when something pops up and we got to spend a week or two trying to iron it out, happens all the time. You lose time. You lose a day there, a day there. Very normal for it to take more like 75 to 90, but it's not the bank. It's not the sell. It's sort of just the process and the third parties involved with delivering the things that are needed throughout the process and then experiencing these unexpected hiccups. So you got to brace yourself. I always just say my biggest advice is just choosing the right SBA lender. Um, if you have a deal that needs to close in a certain amount of time, you've got to sort of pick the lender that knows how to do this, knows what's around the corner, has a good track record of execution. A lot of people don't think about that because we're kind of programmed to look at a term sheet based on the numbers. But what I can tell you is I make a living off of cleaning up other lenders' messes. So there's not like great execution in the SBA world, like in residential, where it's like so cookie cutter. SBA is very different.
Wow, interesting. And I could agree to you on that. I've seen sellers that get nervous around the bank due diligence timelines. I mean, it's not just the buyers asking thing; it's also for the bank. And sometimes, it can appear overwhelming for a lot of people. In fact, it's interesting, and it brings out a very interesting point. I had a PE webinar yesterday, and we did talk about in an M&A deal. We talked about uh, uh, deal stamina, to have that stamina to go through that, to stick to that deal, and be able to stick to everything that has been asked for. Obviously you need to have a house in order, but to be patient about it while the entire process goes across, and whatever is asked for, you're able to deliver. So we talked about that.
That's a really
But
interesting topic,
Mhm.
because by a week or two before the closing is when it gets the worst, right? So even if everyone's done everything perfectly, within those last couple of weeks as we're approaching, you don't have a hard closing date at that point because we're always waiting for something at the tail end of this process that says, hey, we need this, and this so that we can close at this date, but it's still a little bit up in the air. Now, all of a sudden, the realities are setting in for the buyer. I've got to run this thing. I've got to take this over. This is my new life. The seller is saying, is this really going to happen? Am I really going to retire here? And tensions are high. And that's why it's like if there is an incompetent person somewhere in the deal team, which you see, it could be the lender, it could be the attorney on the seller side, it could be the attorney on the buyer side, it could be the attorney on the bank side. We like to blame attorneys around here, but I'm just kidding. Cut that out. No, it's okay. You can leave it in. But like, then just imagine how much compounded it is. I mean, there's just some horror stories out there, and that's why, hopefully people can avoid them by putting the right people around them. But yeah, you're absolutely right, man. It's emotionally, it's very tough to get through this type of process.
To that, man, to that. And you've lined out, you have pointed out 44 points that you listed out, but that's just bust some myths. What is the biggest misconception about SBA in the M&A world that you could share with us?
The first thing that comes to my mind is that what I'm noticing right now is that the rules of SBA lending used to be totally secret. Like you couldn't, if you're a borrower, you don't know what the SOP is. The lenders know what that is. What you've seen in recent years, mainly starting with PPP, is that this guidance would come out from the either Congress pass something,
Yep.
or usually what happens is Congress pass something, then it goes to SBA, SBA turns it into policy. There's points where Congress passes something in a bill that's going to impact SBA where people now know, and they come to me and they say, hey, what does this mean? And I'm like, I don't know. We're all finding out about this at the same time. And then I'm
Yeah.
like, we got to wait for the SBA to provide the guidance. Then the SBA puts out the SOP, and now the borrowers quote SOP, right? So what they need to understand, I guess, if I'm going to go with this answer here, is that the SOP is the lender's minimum requirements. Every lender
Right.
overlays their own requirements on top of the SOP. Every lender does. And so that means every lender you talk to is going to do things differently. This is not a cookie cutter program. That's the biggest misconception, is that this is some sort of standard HUD product. It could not, nothing could be further from the truth. This is an insurance product. It's almost like silly putty being handed to all these banks to say, hey, it's got to look, you've got to hit this, this, and this, but you can mold this whole program however you want. And so that is kind of like the big differentiator, is that, or that is the big misconception, is that not all SBA loans are created the same.
Very interesting. So you got a story for us where things almost fell apart and then got back on track?
Yeah, I mean, it's every day. Happens every day to me. So I don't know. We got to see which story we want to pick from here.
Yeah.
Let's see. Let's go with a fun one here. All right. So I would say I'm going to go with something I alluded to earlier, which is a landlord issue, because people want to know, like, after I'm approved, what can blow up my deal? And the two biggest answers are purchase agreement negotiations, buyer and seller not coming to terms on something, or landlord. When you're buying a business, the landlord has to agree to certain things, and there's no leverage that anyone has really to use to get them to do this. You're just at their mercy. They already have you in there as a tenant. You need to get your lease assigned or create a new lease for the new borrower, and they need to sign this landlord consent form. Depending on the landlord, they may redline it. They may have their own that the bank is going to redline, and a negotiation may ensue. Well, what happens when the landlord says, I am not willing to do a 10-year lease, right? We're doing a 10-year loan. I want a 10-year lease. Could have options, but they're like, I don't even want you to have options. So I've seen this before. We did it with a, what deal was that? I want to say landscaping. And it's in a hot market. So they're in this industrial building in a hot market, and they're just like, you're month to month, and that's it, right? So the SBA does give you a little wiggle room there, but you have to really make the case internally to your people to say, hey, I know we want 10 years and we should get 10 years is what the SBA says, but the landlord's only giving us one. Okay, so I have now encountered this problem a few times, but the way I solve it is, first I ask myself, does the location matter? Are customers going to this location? No. Okay.
Yeah.
So what would moving it do to the business? So then I have to go and I have to say, what's the market right now? Are there similar properties within a certain radius that are available? Is the cost similar? And would moving the business disrupt the business? And if so, how would it be a weekend where they don't, open, or is it no disruption, or what? Sorry, getting over a cold.
Oh, okay.
So we got credit on board basically with a 1-year lease by providing a lot of information that showed that the business would not be disrupted, nor would it have any sort of adverse impact if they moved to the warehouse down the street.
Fantastic. So, all right. Now, before we wrap up, I just want to ask you some last minute things. So, what's your number one advice that you'd want to give to a first time buyer who is trying to use a SBA to buy a firm?
To buy a what? Oh, a firm.
To buy a firm or a business, yeah.
Well, my advice is to let me think about this for a sec. So first time buyer, I would say be very skeptical. Don't rely on third parties to do your due diligence. They work for you, so they can give you information, but you need to be skeptical and approach all of this with skepticism. Healthy skepticism. Just because a lender is willing to say yes doesn't mean it's a good deal. There's additional due diligence that you need to do to make sure it's a good deal. And quite frankly, the way you do due diligence is going to be different for every type of industry. So a big hack would be talking to, like, if you don't have direct industry experience, then talking to someone who does, that has no stake in this transaction, to just say, hey, what would you look for here is invaluable. And a lot of this is relying on the seller. And in this particular industry, I would hope it's less of a problem. These are licensed professionals, but I will say the number one reason I'm seeing cited for deals that are going awry post-closing, not saying it's true, I'll say alleged seller fraud, is what a lot of people point to. They're saying these are not the numbers that I was shown, right? Like there's a disconnect somewhere, so the seller did something funky. I think half of that is honestly on the buyer's side for lack of due diligence. The other half certainly on the seller side. But I would, trust but verify everything and really dig in deep and start with none of this is true. These numbers are all, they're just fairy dust, until I can really go down all the way and confirm every number and really know what I'm buying and ask all of the tough questions and really set yourself up for success.
To that. And for brokers and advisors, how can they better support SBA deal flow?
Brokers and advisors, that's an interesting question. Brokers are very important to all of this, because certainly they get involved, or before, when the seller's like, hey, I think I want to sell my business for $5 million. The broker's the one that has to say, well, it's only worth $2 million, and it's going to take us 6 months, 9 months to sell, and he's there the whole time. So by the time they bring it to market, the broker's like, I really want you to use a bank that knows how to get this done, because we see a lot of banks over here screwing up. Use one of these 2 or 3 guys, and maybe I'm one of them. Well, now I pay the broker a fee. A lot of people don't realize that it gets disclosed before closing, but disclosing something a day before closing is like too late now anyway. So it's interesting. It's not really advice for the advisors, but it is an interesting dynamic that the seller's broker refers us, the lender, to the buyer. Yeah. So we have a relationship with the seller where it's like, all right, I want to keep getting fed over here.
Yeah.
But the buyer's the one that's dealing with all of those consequences, right? The buyer is now working with that lender. And so it's an interesting dynamic. And so I work with a lot of different brokers, and I've seen what works. I've seen what doesn't work. And I mean, I'll offer the advice. I don't know that they'll take it. But the brokers that feel like they need to micromanage the process because that's their job, because maybe they've been burned, rightfully so, I'd probably do the same thing. If you work with the right lenders, the deals, like my deals, they move through like a conveyor belt because we've got it all figured out. So sometimes we deal with a broker and it's and it actually ends up taking longer because we've got to also, explain, no, we actually already did this, and oh no, yeah, and we're just spending time over here saying we're doing our job. So I don't know. That's the first thing that came to mind. I don't know how good that one is.
That's okay. Hey, an advice is an advice nonetheless, So thank you for sharing. Now, before I let you go, where can people find you or about your podcast, or maybe even reach you for SBA guidance?
I would say go to the YouTube channel for sure, SBA Ray. And you can also find me on LinkedIn and X. So I'm not a hard guy to find, honestly.
I agree to that. You're not. So, but nonetheless, for all our listeners who are tuning in, I will leave those things in the show notes as well, so you can get in touch with Ray. If at all you're looking for SBA guidance or anything that you liked about this podcast that you want to reach out to him, that's great. So, with that, Ray, we come to the end of today's podcast. I thank you for your time and your insights. And to our listeners who are tuning in, thank you so much for staying through. And I look forward to seeing you again in the next episode. Until then, take care and have a blessed day ahead. Cheers.
Thank you so much.
Access latest and trending CPE courses with my CPE One Unlimited Access subscription. Subscribe now